Hello everyone, and welcome to this geography video summarizing the first chapter we studied together about the North American metropolis. In this chapter, we studied Chicago, the case of Chicago as a North American metropolis. The first thing we are going to do when studying a city, or rather a place, is to locate it. There are two ways to locate a place. An absolute location and a relative location, or also called a situation. Let's talk first about the absolute location. We already learned how to do that in the knowledge sheet number 1, so I will ask you to have a look at it if you don't remember. To locate a place absolutely, we are using a coordinate system. You can see it here, we are crossing two coordinates. And for this, we need to draw some imaginary lines around the globe. The first one we draw are called the parallels. Because they are parallel to the equator, and they extend from the equator to the poles. The second set of lines are crossing the parallels in a 90-degree angle. We are calling them the meridians. They are imaginary north-south lines connecting the poles. These lines, we need to measure them, and to measure them we are using what we call latitudes and longitudes. The parallels are measured by the latitude. The latitude, it's an angle formed at the center of the Earth and the plane of the equator, and the place we want to locate. Here the example is a 30 degrees northern latitude. That gives us New Orleans here. This latitude can go from 0 degree at the plane of the equator to, if we go up here to the pole, 90 degrees. It can be either north, like here, the North Pole, at 90 degrees, or they can also be south. That would be the South Pole down there. The second coordinates, the meridians, are given by the longitude. The longitude is an angle that starts here at the prime meridian, and it's an angle that can range from 0 degree to 180 degrees. 180 degrees, that will be halfway around the Earth, and that means the longitude could be either west or east. By crossing those coordinates, we can locate a place very accurately. Let's take the example of Chicago. Let me remind you that to measure and to calculate the coordinates of a place, you have know-how sheet. The number 2 will tell you exactly how to calculate the geographic coordinates of a place. So the first thing to do is to locate Chicago. So here we have the North American continent, and I see, yeah, here's Chicago. I will mark it now with a big red dot. The first coordinate we want to know is usually the latitude. We always begin with the latitude. Don't ask me why, it's just like that. So here we are looking at these lines. You see, the parallels are horizontal lines and the meridians are vertical lines. Here we see that they are not very horizontal and vertical because the projection of this map is a bit particular. But anyway, we can still calculate the coordinates by looking here. The first line, the closest line here, the closest parallel is the 40th parallel. So yeah, the latitude, the 40th parallel. Don't confuse it with the 60 here. That is a meridian, that is 60th meridian west. Here is 40th parallel north, but it's not exactly on the line. So I will have to check the other parallel here, 60 degrees. So I know that Chicago is somewhere between the 40th and 60th parallel. Of course, it's much closer to the 40th. I will have to make a proportion calculation. I'll have to measure the distance here and measure the distance from Chicago to the 40th and make a simple proportional rule to find the latitude. Again, if you want to know how to do that, you have your know-how sheet number 2 here. So I'll make the calculation for you, and indeed it's very close to the 40th parallel because it's at 41 degrees and 50 minutes north of the equator. Now the second set of coordinates we want to know is the longitude. The longitude, I will check the meridians for that. Here I have the longitude, yes, I have here the 80th meridian, indeed, it's the closest one, and the 100th meridian, west, of course. We are west of the prime meridian, which goes through Greenwich, as you know. I'll have to do the same principle here. I'll have to measure the distance between these two lines, these two meridians, going on Chicago, because if I measure here, you see that the distance from the 80th and the 100th meridian here is not the same as the distance between the same meridians from here to there. I'll have to measure this distance, and I'll have to measure the distance separating Chicago from the closest meridian. And by making a simple proportional rule, I might get 87 degrees and 37 minutes west of Greenwich meridian. Of course, we can also give a third coordinate, which is the altitude, 177 meters high. After we've set the absolute location, we want to know the relative location, also called the situation. You can check the knowledge sheet number 1. The relative location is to locate a place in relation to another geographical reference. The coordinate system is not always easy, because if I tell you Chicago is 40 degrees north and 87 degrees west, it's really hard to imagine where it is. But if you have some references, some geographical references about North American, it's much easier. If I tell you, yeah, Chicago is north of that place or south of that one. That's why we use cardinal points, north, south, west, east, and relation with the landmarks. That could be other cities, that could be mountains, that could be rivers, or any other some place that you know and that other people know. So if we try to do that on a map, look here, we have a nice physical map of the United States, where we clearly see the mountains and the rivers. It's a hydrography and physical map. You can see the big red dot here. It's more or less where is Chicago, and there we can locate a place in comparison with other places. We usually start from the general and go to the particular. If I start at the continental level, I could say that Chicago is in the middle of the North American continent. But if I go country-wise, I could say that it's in the Middle Eastern region of the USA. But I can go to a regional scale, saying that Chicago is northeast of the Great Plains, south of Lake Michigan, northwest from the Mississippi River in the state of Illinois. But for that, you need to have some geographical references. That's why we studied that in school, so that you know that the Rocky Mountains, this is a high mountain range west of the North American continent. You know that the Appalachian Mountains are a lower mountain range on the eastern side of the continent, and in between you have a network, a river network in the middle of the United States. Some very important rivers to know are the Mississippi here, taking its source in Minnesota in the north and flowing south right across the country. You have the Missouri, which is a tributary river starting at the northwest of the USA in the Rocky Mountains and flowing southeast and joining here the Mississippi and flowing into the New Orleans where it has his mouth. But other important rivers are, of course, the Colorado River, which takes its source in the Rocky Mountains, crossing the Colorado Plateau and giving the famous Grand Canyon, and flowing, when it flows, to the Gulf of California. And another very important river is the Rio Grande, that marks the border with Mexico, between Mexico and the United States. The other things you need to know is the peninsula of Florida, the peninsula of California, the Boswas megalopolis with Boston, New York, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. and of course the Great Lakes. That's very important to know, and we know that Chicago is south of the Great Lakes. And if we look at the state level, we could say that Chicago is northeast of the state of Illinois in the southwest coast of Lake Michigan. Now that we have located Chicago, we are going to focus on the city organization. Like many other North American cities, Chicago is organized in 3 major neighborhoods. First, the Central Business District, also known as the Historical Center, and the 19th century neighborhoods. We will see why it's called the 19th century neighborhoods, and of course the suburbs. But first of all, let's see the layout of Chicago. We can see that the streets are crossing according to a grid. That means that the streets are crossing with each other at a right angle. Now let's have a look at the Central Business District of Chicago. The Central Business District, we can differentiate here 2 kinds of buildings. Usually they are very high buildings, but on the left picture you see that the material and the architecture is a bit different from the picture on the right. The reason is that the time of building these buildings is different. The buildings on the left picture were built before World War II, and the Sears Tower here on the right has been built after World War II, and you see the architecture is different, the material is different. But in the Central Business District, the main functions are commercial, administrative, and cultural. People go there, gather there to work, to do business. Therefore, it's very active during the day, but very quiet at night. There's a small resident population in comparison with the working population. There's a large working population, actually. The very high cost of land leads to higher buildings. As the land costs a lot, we will now build higher and higher buildings. These are usually called skyscrapers. Where is it located? You can see that the Central Business District here on the purple area. Around this Central Business District, you have the 19th century neighborhoods. We can split them into 3 different areas. We have the high-income residential area, the low-income residential area, also called ghettos, and the industrial area. All these areas have the same origin at the same period, in the 19th century. The first picture you see here, it's an old factory. Now it has been repurposed and rehabilitated into another function, maybe commercial, maybe residential. The other pictures show you the brownstones houses and here apartment building. Now the low-income residential area, you also find the brownstones, but very less well maintained. It's much poorer, a much poorer neighborhood. You can also find apartment buildings, but in bad shape, bad condition, and people living there are usually ethnic minorities: black people, Hispanic people, Asiatic people. Like here, you can see Chinatown, and at the first level, the ground floor of the apartment buildings, you can usually find some shops. So how can we define ghettos? A poor, densely populated city district occupied by a minority ethnic group linked together by economic hardship and social restrictions. Where are they located? Residential areas, whether they are poor or rich, are usually gathered around the Central Business District. Close to the industrial area because it's give the workforce for industrial area. You can find different kinds of buildings, apartment buildings and brownstones houses. The buildings well maintained usually show that it belongs to a middle or to an upper class population, and the buildings that are not well maintained, they usually show that you are in the ghetto. The main function of these areas are, of course, residential. People live there and they go to the center to work. And finally, the industrial area are usually gathered around communications like waterways, here, the river, railways, like here, and roadways. Here is an example of a factory, and here a street in industrial area. It's usually located close to the residential neighbourhoods and close to the water. Parts of this area can be rehabilitated. The third spatial unit of a city is the suburbs. The suburbs are residential districts located immediately outside of a city. We can distinguish two suburban areas. The first suburban belt, usually dating before the World War II, before the democratization of cars, and the second suburban belt, much further from the center of the city, and dated after the World War II, after the democratization of a car, allowing to drive longer distance to go to work. Whereas the first suburban belt, right around the 19th century, residential and industrial area. They are still inside the city limits. The functions are residential and commercial, and it offers a lot of services to the local population like schools or libraries, public transportation. The population living in it is mostly middle class and cosmopolitan. It's still a diverse and mixed origin population. This area has been developed between World War I and World War II. But the second suburban area is located much further from the center. It's usually outside the city limits, and the small towns around the city have been absorbed by the urbanization. The population is usually middle to higher class and mostly white. And you can find new business districts developing in these little towns on the second belt to avoid losing time in congestion, in traffic to go to work in the center. If we have to summarize the different spatial units, we can see the origin of the city is in the central business district, right here in the purple area. And then around it, you have the 19th century residential area and the industrial area along the river or very close to the center. And then around these 19th century areas, you have the suburban belts dated from the 20th century, and more or less the limit is approximative. And the second suburban belt is much further, encompassing old towns. So how could we simplify this? Because it's rather complex, shown like this. And as a geographer, we like to simplify things to find patterns, because the layout in Chicago is maybe like this, but in another city that could be rather different. So we come to work on the model. We'll try to modelize, to simplify what we saw. We'll see how the land is used, and that gives us a land use model. And we can also try to make a transact. We'll see what does it mean just right now. We can use different land use models. The goal of a land use model is to simplify urban structures and to understand how cities grow. So yeah, the two different models, the concentric model, the city develops in rings from a central source, a bit like an onion. And the sector model, it introduced the idea of sector linked to roads, railways, rivers, attracting industry and low quality housing. And yeah, that's the question, which model would you use for Chicago? Here's another model showing you what we call the centrifugal movement. What does it mean? It means like immigrants here in the early 19th century, they arrive, they settle around the central business district already existing. In the late 19th century, you have a new wave of migrants that's coming. The older migrants, they move outside the city, and they move away from the poor areas to build new buildings. They leave them vacant for the next wave of immigrants, and so on. Early in 20th century, a new wave of migrants, and you see that movement again and again. Okay, now what is a transect? A transect is a cut across the city to show its structure and organization. Let's cut Chicago, like here, cutting from east to west. And what does it give us? This cut. And you see the CBD in the center. You see the 19th century's neighborhoods on the sides, the first urban belts and the second suburban belts, including the new central business districts. Good. Now what about the population? We saw a lot about buildings, roads, and so on. What about the population? Well, we'll look at the population growth. How does the population grow around? Well, in Chicago particularly. That leads us to the population density, the notion of density, how the income, where are the poor and the richer people located. I think you already have an idea about that, but we will verify on the model now. And we'll talk about racial segregation. Population growth, let me remind you that you have knowledge sheet that explains you how to calculate this rate. We can see here a little graph showing the explosion, the demographic explosion. This is a million of inhabitants, and you see it started 1860 and went up to 1960. How come the population grew so fast and so much? This is a question we're going to keep for later. But how to calculate the growth rate? Chicago population growth rate between 1840 and 1950 is calculated with this formula. Population growth rate equals the population at time 2 here minus the population at time 1 here divided population at time 1. Let's put the data in it. 3 million people minus 4,470 people divided by 4,470 people. That gives us a rate of 809% of growth within 100 years, more or less. That's phenomenal. It's huge, a huge growth. Why? The question is why? Why did it grow so much? Keep that question for later. What about the population density? The density, the notion of density, there are different ways to figure it. Usually we use the color shades to show that an area is more densely populated than another one. For Chicago, let's see, the density is usually defined by the number of people living in a set area. The area usually used in human geography is kilometer square. So here the population divided by the surface, the area, the population of the city center, only the city center of Chicago is 2,700,000 people, and the area is 606 kilometer square. So if we simply divide the population by the surface, it gives us a density of 4,486 square kilometers. Of course, this population is not evenly distributed. Some neighborhoods, some areas are more densely populated than others, which leads to the question, which are the densest neighborhoods according to you, and why are they more dense than other ones? Try to guess that. We'll try to answer that by analyzing an interactive map. Here, that's an interactive map of the USA population density. First, look here at the USA. You can directly identify what zones of the country are the most populated. You directly see the East Coast from Boston to Washington, the Waugh megalopolis that is much more densely populated than here, the middle of the country with the Rocky Mountains and the plateaus and the Great Plains here. But let's focus on Chicago. We wanted to know what were the most densely populated areas of Chicago. So let's have a look at it. Let's zoom in. And you see that you have different shades of orange to brown. You see that the further you go from the city center, the less dense it is. Now if we zoom in even closer, you can see that the city center is much more populated, much more dense than the surroundings. Okay, do you remember the concentric circles of the Burgess model? On this document, let's try to identify the central business district, the 19th century neighborhoods, and the suburbs. You can see that the population is not evenly distributed in Chicago. Explain why the city center is more densely populated than the 19th century neighborhoods or the suburbs. Now we would like to know more about the socioeconomic level of the people living in the city. For this, we use the median household income. The median household income is the amount that divides the income distribution into two equal groups, half having income above the amount and half having income below the amount. I will show you an interactive map here. This interactive map shows the median household income in the US. In other words, it shows how wealthy or rich the families are. The poorest families can be seen in red, as the wealthiest families can be seen in blue. These areas here and here and here and here have the poorest families here as well. And the megalopolis have the richest families. Now let's zoom into Chicago. How well Chicago is doing. Interesting. You see here Gary is very poor, and you see that Evanston is very rich. But let's get closer to Chicago. Interesting. Okay, this is the central business district, or the loop. You can see that north of it, we have some pretty wealthy families here, and here a bit less wealthy, and here as well, down south. And then around it, it gets better and better. Okay, I've put it here, and that's the observation we made. The central business district is rather rich, and here in the north you see it's poor, and it's very rich, sorry, and here it's poor, and here as well. Fortunately, we cannot talk about American cities without talking about racial segregation. Racial segregation is a separation of humans into racial groups in daily life. Look here on this very interesting map. Each dot represents a people by its ethnic origin. Black are in gray, white people are in blue, Asiatic people are in red, Hispanic people are in orange, others are in brown. You can see on this picture that's the spatial segregation is very clear. You have south of the 8 Mile Road a majority of black people living there, and north of the 8 Mile Road in Detroit a majority of white people living there. So let's see if we can observe the same phenomenon in Chicago. For this, I found a very interesting map on the internet. It's called a racial dot map. Each dot represents a people. I told it to you already. Here, look at the big picture of the United States of America, and you can directly see the density of population is different, and also that in some areas you can find more people of one ethnic than in other areas. Mostly on the half east of the United States, it's mostly populated by white people. In the south, here south of the Appalachian Mountains, you can find more black people. In the cities, you can find a bit of red, that means more Asiatic people, a bit more on the west coast. And down south, you can find more orange, that means you can find more Hispanic people. Okay, now let's zoom in to Chicago to see if we can find that racial segregation, that spatial segregation by races. Zoom in. Okay, now we got a good picture of Chicago. This is the central business district. Maybe I can add some labels. Yep. Let's see if we find this segregation. Very interesting. You can see that down south here it's mostly populated by black people. Then you have an area with a lot of Hispanic people. The Asiatic people, the Asiatic community is gathering here, sorry. And here more to the west, here again black people, a bit of Hispanic, and then we get back to white people, and this is a more cosmopolitan area. It's mixed from mixed ethnies, and then all around it you have a majority of white people. Maybe here some Asiatic people living there. Okay, if we zoom into Chicago, you can see that in the city center the population is much more mixed than in the 19th century neighborhoods and in the suburbs. Very interesting. Now let's try to compare this map where you show the ethnies, where you can see the ethnies, with another map, the map of the median household income. And let's see if we can make some links. Let me remind you the definition of the racial segregation. It's a separation of humans into racial groups in daily life. And here, for the case of Chicago, you can see that it radiates around it. That's it for me. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it helped you preparing your lesson. More video will come, so see you again.